throughout the annals of military history. Nations have boasted of their invincible warriors, their impenetrable fortresses, and their terrifying weapons of destruction. Yet, when the crucible of World War II demanded the ultimate test of superpower dominance, Nazi Germany did not fall merely to superior firepower, but to an unstoppable, roaring avalanche of American industrial might. In the late summer of 1944, as the Allies shattered the German lines in Normandy, the world witnessed the awakening of a logistical titan that no empire on earth could match. While the brilliant strategists of the Wehrmacht prided themselves on centuries of rigid military doctrine, they fundamentally misunderstood the fierce, unyielding spirit of American ingenuity. They looked at the map of Europe and calculated that the advancing American armies would inevitably starve, freeze, and collapse under their own momentum. What the German High Command was about to learn, in the most humiliating fashion imaginable, was that when you provoke the American giant, you do not just fight a military, you fight a relentless, 24-hour economic powerhouse that rewrites the very laws of physics and warfare to achieve total victory. By late August 1944, the Allied liberation of France was moving at a breakneck, historical speed, spearheaded by the relentless armor of General George S. Patton's Third Army. But this unprecedented velocity created a logistical nightmare that would have forced any other army in human history into a panicked retreat. Patton's roaring Sherman tanks and mechanized divisions were consuming a staggering 350,000 gallons of gasoline every single day, stretching the supply lines to their absolute breaking point. The primary deepwater ports were still sabotaged by retreating Nazi forces, and the French railway network had been completely obliterated by Allied pre-invasion bombing campaigns. Every brilliant mile the Americans advanced took them further away from their supply depots on the Normandy beaches, creating a perilous vacuum where ammunition, food, and fuel were dangerously depleted. Watching from their bunkers, German field marshals smiled with absolute certainty, believing they had lured the overextended Americans into a fatal trap. They knew that a mechanized army without fuel is nothing more than a collection of sitting ducks, and they prepared to launch a devastating counteroffensive to drive the Allies back into the sea. Yet, the American response to this existential crisis was not a tactical withdrawal, but an industrial miracle engineered in just 36 hours. Recognizing that the frontline soldiers needed a lifeline, Allied planners designed and unleashed a massive, closed-loop trucking highway system known as the Red Ball Express. The U.S. Army seized to parallel, ruined routes stretching across the French countryside, strictly banning civilian traffic and standard military marches to dedicate these roads entirely to high-speed supply convoys. The northern route became a one-way superhighway rushing vital cargo to the front, while the southern route served as the empty return loop back to the beaches. Operating under a fierce and unyielding discipline, thousands of standard 2.5-ton GMC trucks, affectionately known as the Deuce and a Half, formed an endless, roaring convoy that moved 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The rules of the road were absolute. Trucks traveled in tight formations, maintaining a steady pace to preserve engines and tires, transforming the scarred French landscape into a relentless assembly line of freedom. The true backbone of this logistical miracle, however, belonged to a group of men who performed superhuman feats of endurance while fighting a dual battle against the enemy and systemic adversity. Because the U.S. military was segregated at the time, approximately 75% of all the drivers and mechanics assigned to the grueling Red Ball Express were African-American soldiers. These unsung heroes drove for 24, 36, and sometimes 48 hours straight without a single moment of sleep, navigating narrow, bomb-cratered roads in the pitch-black darkness of night. To avoid attracting the attention of lurking German Luftwaffe bombers, they were forced to drive using only tiny, hooded blackout lights that barely illuminated the hood of their vehicles. They braved hidden landmines, sudden sniper fire, and a bone-crushing physical exhaustion that caused many to hallucinate behind the wheel. Yet they refused to lift their feet from the gas pedals, because they knew their brothers on the front line were counting on them. As the weeks pressed on, The German high command waited in vain for the American lines to fracture and starve. But instead, they watched in absolute horror as the American war machine grew stronger, faster, and more aggressive. When battered and exhausted German forces were captured or overrun, the staggering contrast between the two factions left the Wehrmacht completely traumatized. The Nazi army was struggling to find basic coal, their soldiers were wrapping rags around their worn-out boots, and their artillery was being pulled by horses due to a catastrophic lack of fuel. Yet, when German officers inspected captured American positions, they did not just find ammunition and gasoline. They discovered that the Red Ball Express was so flawlessly efficient that it was delivering fresh mail from home. Cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, and even refrigerated ingredients for fresh ice cream directly to the mud of the front lines. In their private diaries and subsequent interrogation reports, captured German generals expressed absolute disbelief, realizing they were not just fighting a rival military, but an unbeatable titan that could pamper its frontline soldiers with the comforts of home while waging a brutal, total war. Ultimately, the grand history books often glorify the dramatic clashes of tanks and the sweeping strategies of generals. But the liberation of Europe was truly won on the roaring axles of the Red Ball Express. The tireless drivers and brilliant planners of this operation proved to the entire world that American exceptionalism is not just defined by inventing the deadliest weapons, but by an unparalleled cultural capability to organize, outproduce, and outdeliver any adversary on the face of the earth. They transformed an impossible logistical disaster into a legendary triumph of human will and industrial power. When the enemies of freedom calculated that the American spirit would stall out in the face of overwhelming odds, the heroes of the Red Ball Express simply stepped on the gas, proving forever that the arsenal of democracy will always find a way to deliver victory.